The first thing I noticed was the tiny red light. It was so small, I almost thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A pinprick of red, blinking once every few seconds from the smoke detector above my bedroom door. I stood frozen on the carpet with my hand still on the doorknob, staring up at it. At first, my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe the battery was low. Maybe it was some kind of sensor. But I knew my apartment. I had lived in that room for 4 months, and that little light had never been there before. My stomach tightened. I dragged a chair from the desk to the center of the room, climbed up, and stared at the smoke detector from arm's length. There was a tiny black hole hidden in the plastic, a lens, a camera lens. My breath stopped so hard it hurt. For a second, I just stood there staring, waiting for the room to make sense again. Then, I saw the second one, inside the clock on my dresser, and the third, tucked into the little charging cube on my nightstand. My whole body went cold. Someone had been watching me sleep, changing clothes, pacing in my room at night when I thought I was alone, watching everything. I tore the clock off the dresser, and it hit the wall and shattered. I ripped the charger from the outlet and heard a tiny clicking sound inside the plastic. The smoke detector came down next, hanging from its wires like a dead eye. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely breathe, but one thought cut through the panic like a blade. I immediately knew whose hand it was. No one else in the world had access to this apartment. No one else knew where I kept my spare key. No one else had ever looked at me the way my older brother Mason did when he thought something was his before it belonged to him. And no one else had a reason to hide cameras in my room except someone desperate enough to steal what my father had left behind. My name is Claire Bennett, and 3 weeks before I found those cameras, I had buried my father. People always say grief feels like drowning, but for me, it felt more like walking around with broken glass inside my chest. My father, Daniel Bennett, had been the kind of man who could fix a leaking sink, calm a child crying in a grocery store, and still make time to ask how your day was as if the answer mattered. He wasn't rich, not in the flashy way people imagine when they hear inheritance. But he had built something real. He owned a small construction company in Ohio, and after 30 years of work, the business, the house, the equipment, the accounts, all of it had been left in a trust with one clear plan. The company was supposed to be divided between me and my brother Mason. That was what my father told us in the hospital 6 days before he died. He was weak, his voice thin, but he was still sharp enough to look both of us in the eye and say, "You two will need to work together." Mason had nodded like a son receiving a sacred mission. He even squeezed my father's hand and said, "Of course, Dad. Always." I wanted to believe him. Mason was 3 years older than me, charming when he wanted to be, the kind of man who could make a room laugh while quietly taking from everyone in it. Growing up, he always had a way of turning our parents against each other, then acting innocent when the damage was done. If I got a prize at school, he needed one too. If I got praise, he found a reason to diminish it. If I spoke up, he accused me of being dramatic. He had spent years learning how to make selfishness look like ambition. But after Dad got sick, Mason changed. At least, that's what I thought. He showed up at the hospital every day. He handled paperwork. He talked to accountants. He brought coffee for nurses. When our father died, Mason gave the eulogy and cried so convincingly that people in the church reached for tissues and praised him in the parking lot for being such a strong son. I stood at the back, numb and exhausted, and told myself maybe we were finally seeing the same loss the same way. I was wrong. The first crack came at the reading of the will. It happened in the office of our father's attorney, a man named Edgar Shaw, whose gray suit looked too expensive for the size of the town. I sat beside Mason in a room that smelled like leather and old paper, while the lawyer adjusted his glasses and opened the envelope. He read the will slowly, outlining the basic terms: the company, the house, the bank accounts, the truck, Dad's personal items. I listened carefully, heart pounding, waiting for the part where it would say Mason and I were equal partners. Then Edgar cleared his throat and said, "There is a codicil attached." I frowned. "A what?" "A supplemental provision," he said. "Your father made changes shortly before his passing." Mason leaned back in his chair. "Go on." Edgar continued reading, and with every word, I felt the floor tilt under me. The company, according to the new amendment, would be placed entirely under Mason's control as the acting executor. The house would go to Mason as well, to maintain continuity for the business and family. I was left with a smaller cash amount from a separate account and the contents of the guest room and personal items previously designated to Claire. I stared at him. That can't be right. Edgar removed his glasses and folded them in his hand. "This is what your father signed." Mason did not look shocked. He did not even look surprised. He looked prepared. "Dad must have had his reasons," he said softly, turning to me with practiced sadness. "Claire, you know he trusted me to keep things stable." I looked at him hard enough to make his smile flicker. "Stable? You mean you got everything?" "That's not fair." "No," I said. "What's not fair is that Dad told me the opposite in the hospital." Edgar glanced between us uncomfortably. "If there is a dispute, you'll need to challenge the validity of the amendment. Otherwise, it stands." I watched Mason's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. That tiny reaction was all I needed to know he had something to hide. After the meeting, I followed him outside into the parking lot. "Why didn't you tell me about the codicil?" I demanded. He turned toward me with the same expression he used as a teenager when he'd been caught stealing change from Mom's purse. "Because I didn't know it existed until yesterday." "Liar." His eyes narrowed. "You really want to do this right now? Dad is barely in the ground. You were acting like this was the plan." He took a step toward me and lowered his voice. "Listen carefully, Claire. You're emotional. I get it. But the company needs a steady hand. You've got your apartment, your little job, your life. Let me handle this." "My little job?" I repeated. He shrugged. "You know what I mean." That was the moment I knew two things. First, Mason had already decided I was supposed to back down. Second, if he had hidden the cameras in my room, he was looking for something specific, probably the key to Dad's safe deposit box, or some old documents Dad kept at my apartment after the funeral. Maybe both. I didn't confront him about the cameras that day. Not yet. I spent the next week pretending I was too exhausted to care while secretly documenting everything. I bought a small lockbox for my important papers, changed passwords, and started checking my apartment every time I came home. Nothing else looked touched. That made me feel worse, not better. Whoever had planted those devices had done it carefully. That meant they'd been in my room more than once. And there was only one person I knew who had been in my apartment alone. Mason had helped me carry boxes after the funeral. He'd offered to check my smoke detector while he was here, because he claimed it looked loose. He had hugged me in the doorway that day, his hand pressed against the back of my shoulder just long enough to make me think he was being kind. Now I understood he'd been measuring where to put the camera. I took the devices to a private electronics shop on the other side of town, where the owner agreed to examine them after hours. His name was Andre, a retired army mechanic with a calm face and the kind of voice that made you trust him immediately. He spent 20 minutes opening the smoke detector, the clock, and the charger. When he finished, he looked up at me, and his expression had turned serious. "These are live streaming units," he said. "Not just recording, remote access. Someone could watch these feeds on a phone or laptop from anywhere." My throat tightened. "Can you tell who installed them?" "Not from this," he said. "But whoever did knew what they were doing. Could they be bought online?" He nodded. "Sure, but the placement? The choice of objects? This was personal." That word hit me like a slap. Personal. I drove home with my heart hammering and every stoplight feeling like a threat. I kept hearing Dad's voice in my head from the hospital. "You two will need to work together." Did he know? Had Mason already started turning on me before Dad died? Was this why Dad had changed the will? No, I refused to believe Dad would cut me out without warning. He had always trusted me with his accounts, his records, the business ledger whenever I helped around the office. He used to say, I noticed details other people missed. Maybe that was the only reason I figured out the truth before Mason could bury it. The next morning, I went to Dad's old office. The building sat behind the hardware store on a strip of cracked pavement that smelled like sawdust and rain. It looked the same as it always had. Faded sign, dented front desk, framed photos of job sites on the walls. But the minute I walked in, I knew someone had been there before me. The filing cabinet drawers didn't sit right. A stack of invoices had been moved, and Dad's desk, which he used to keep locked, was standing half open. Mason was already inside. He looked up from Dad's desk and smiled like we had run into each other at a cafe. Didn't think you'd come by, he said. I stared at the open drawer behind him. What are you doing? Cleaning up. That's funny, I said. Because it looks like you're searching. His smile thinned. Edgar said I should organize Dad's documents. Edgar told you to go through the desk without me? He told me I'm the executor. Temporary executor, I said. Until the estate is settled. Mason closed the drawer and folded his arms. You still don't understand how this works. I took another step into the office and caught something. A fresh scratch on the left side of the desk. It looked like someone had pried the drawer open in a hurry. Dad kept a small brass key taped inside the underside of that desk. He had shown it to me years ago, back when he joked that family business always got ugly after funerals. My pulse jumped. Mason noticed me looking. What? He asked. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. He knew where the key was, or at least he thought he did. My father had moved it after I started helping him with the books. He'd hidden it inside the old wall clock above the filing cabinet, a clock Mason never bothered to touch because it was ugly and dusty and not worth stealing. I waited until Mason stepped into the back room to answer a phone call. Then I moved fast, climbed on a chair, and reached behind the clock. My fingers closed around the brass key, and taped to the back of it was a folded note in my father's handwriting. Claire, if anything happens to me, trust no one immediately, especially not your brother. Check the lockbox under the floor panel in my closet. I nearly dropped the note. The back room door creaked, and I shoved the key and note into my coat pocket just as Mason came back. What are you doing up there? He asked. Nothing. My voice came out steady, which surprised even me. He studied my face, as if trying to decide whether I knew something. For 1 second, just one, I saw panic in his eyes. Then it vanished. Fine, he said. Since you're here, maybe you can help. There are some old contracts missing. Missing from where? He leaned on the desk. Dad's files. I need them to settle the business. Something in me went cold again. Which contracts? The ones connected to the Riverside Development Project. That made my stomach drop. Riverside was the deal Dad had been chasing for almost a year. A big renovation project with a local developer. If it went through, the company would be secure for years. Dad had been excited about it, but in the final month of his illness, he'd stopped talking about it entirely. I had assumed he was too weak to keep up. Now, Mason was asking about it with too much intensity. You didn't tell me Dad had a project like that, I said. Mason straightened. Because you weren't involved. That is not true. It is now. I left before I said something that would make him suspicious. Outside, in the summer heat, I sat in my car and opened Dad's note again. Check the lockbox under the floor panel in my closet. I went straight back to my apartment and nearly ripped the bedroom closet apart before I found it. Beneath an old storage basket, there was a loose board in the floor. I lifted it with a butter knife and uncovered a small metal box wrapped in duct tape. Inside were documents, a bank statement, a USB drive, and a photograph that made my hands go numb. It was Mason standing beside a man I recognized from Dad's office, a developer named Grant Holloway. They were shaking hands in what looked like a restaurant booth. On the back of the photo, in Dad's handwriting, were 2 words, bribe evidence. I sat on the bedroom floor with my knees pulled up and stared at those words until they blurred. Dad had known. The USB drive held more. Scanned emails. Invoices, a spreadsheet showing money moving from Holloway's company into an account tied to a shell business under Mason's name. There were also recordings. Dad's voice, low and exhausted, speaking into what sounded like a hidden phone recorder. Mason says it's temporary. Says he just needs access to the funds until the permits come through. But he keeps changing the numbers. I don't trust this. Another recording. He took the company's stamp from my desk. He said he'd bring it back. Another. Claire needs to know. I had to stop listening because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the drive steady. Dad had been trying to warn me, and Mason had been stealing behind his back while Dad was dying. The betrayal hurt so much it almost made me sick. But the next feeling that rose beneath the grief was something sharper. Rage. I didn't call Mason. I called an attorney named Nora Pike, a woman my friend from college recommended because she had a reputation for dismantling estate fraud cases. Nora was direct, no nonsense, and listened without interrupting while I laid everything out. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have the original will?" "No. Mason has the documents. Do you have proof your father intended something different?" I told her about the note, the recordings, the USB drive, and the photo. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, "Bring everything to my office in an hour." When I got there, Nora spread the documents out on her desk and listened to the recordings through headphones. By the time she finished, her face had hardened. "This is not just a dispute," she said. "This is a possible estate fraud, elder exploitation, and financial misconduct case. Can we prove the will was changed under pressure?" "Maybe," she said. "But it gets better. If Mason accessed your father's accounts or used company funds to benefit himself, the bank records will tell the story." My breath caught. "He did. How do you know?" I handed her the bank statement. She scanned it and nodded slowly. "This account was opened 6 months ago. That lines up with the project timeline." "Can we freeze it?" "If we move fast, yes. But I need you to do exactly what I say." She looked at me with those sharp, steady eyes. "And you need to prepare yourself. People like this do not crumble politely when cornered." She was right. The moment Mason realized I wasn't giving up, he changed tactics. He started calling me constantly. At first, the messages were sweet, concerned. "You okay? Call me back. We should talk like adults." Then came the threats disguised as advice. "You're making a mistake. Dad would be disappointed. Don't let outsiders poison you against your own family." I ignored him, so he showed up at my apartment. I didn't let him in. I stood behind the chain lock with my arms crossed and his face reflected in the hallway mirror behind him. He looked tired, but not guilty. People like Mason rarely look guilty. They look offended that you made them work for your trust. "You've been talking to a lawyer," he said. "I have." He exhaled, as if I were the problem. "Claire, listen to me. What's in that box? Whatever you think you found, it's not what it looks like. Then explain the cameras in my room." His expression didn't change fast enough. That was all the answer I needed. He realized it too, because his jaw tightened and his voice went cold. "You went through my things? You mean my room?" He stepped closer to the door, lowering his voice. "You do not understand what's at stake." "Then help me understand." "Dad was confused at the end," he said. "He was sick. He made mistakes. I was trying to protect the family. With hidden cameras." His eyes flashed. "I was trying to find the paperwork before you ruined everything." "Everything? Or your little scam with Holloway?" At that, his face changed completely. Not surprise. Not denial. Fear. He looked over his shoulder down the hall, then back at me. "You have no idea what Holloway is capable of." "Funny," I said. "I was about to say the same about you." He stared at me for a long second, and I saw something behind his eyes I had never noticed before. Not just greed, not just ambition. Panic. He was afraid of something bigger than me. When he finally spoke again, his voice had gone low and urgent. "Claire, stop digging. Just stop. I'll make this right." "You already decided what right looked like," I said. "It started with cameras." His gaze hardened. "Don't force me to get ugly." I laughed once, bitter and sharp. You? You planted cameras in my bedroom after Dad died. You are already ugly. For the first time, he looked like he might slap the door. Instead, he stepped back and said, "Fine, but when this blows up, don't say I didn't warn you." Then he walked away. I called Nora immediately. By the next morning, she had filed an emergency motion to preserve estate assets and request disclosure of the company records, the bank transfers, and the original will file from Edgar Shaw's office. She also filed a police report about the surveillance devices. The officers who came to my apartment took photos, bagged the cameras, and promised to send them to cybercrime. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because 2 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Come alone to the old marina at 8 p.m. If you want to know what your father was hiding, bring the USB drive." I almost deleted it. Then another message came through. "Ask me about the warehouse fire from 2019. That stopped me cold. The warehouse fire was a family ghost no one talked about. 7 years earlier, one of Dad's work sites had burned after hours. No one was hurt, but the insurance claim had turned into an ugly investigation over missing records and suspicious wiring. Dad had been cleared, but I remembered the tension in our house for weeks afterward. Mason had acted strange then too, staying out late and snapping at everyone. I had never connected that fire to anything until that text. I showed Nora the messages. She frowned, then said, "Do not go alone. I'm not letting him control the story." "Then we go together," she said. At the marina, the air smelled like wet wood and diesel. The old warehouse at the end of the dock stood dark and sagging against the night sky. Nora and I parked a block away and approached from the side, staying close to the shadows. There was a light on inside. We slipped through a side door left unlatched and found Mason standing at a folding table with a file spread out in front of him. He looked more tired than angry, which somehow made him look worse. Behind him stood Grant Holloway. I had seen the man in office, photos, and a few community events, but in person he had the polished smile of a shark, expensive watch, white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, the kind of man who never seemed to sweat, no matter how dirty the business got. "Well," Grant said, glancing at Nora, "this is inconvenient." Mason swore under his breath. "I said come alone. You did not get to set terms after sending threats," Nora replied coolly. Grant smiled at me. "Claire Bennett, I've heard a lot about you." "You don't know me. I know your father knew when to make a deal." My pulse thundered. "What did you do to him?" Grant tilted his head. "That depends on what version of the story you prefer." Mason turned sharply toward him. "No, that's not what we agreed." I looked from one to the other. "Agreed on what?" Mason ran a hand over his face, the first crack in his confidence I had seen in weeks. "You want the truth?" he said. "Fine. The truth is, Holloway was using Dad's company to funnel money. Dad found out. He was going to report it." Grant's smile didn't move. "And your brother helped me keep the company afloat when your father got stubborn." "Keep it afloat?" I repeated. "You mean steal from it?" Mason pointed at Grant, suddenly furious. "You said it was temporary." "I said many things," Grant replied. "You heard what you needed." Mason whirled on me. "Claire, I needed the money to cover the accounts. Dad was dying, the project was collapsing, and there were penalties if the permits got delayed." "By penalties, you mean your debts." His silence was answer enough. Nora's voice cut through the room. "What debts?" Mason's face went pale. Grant sighed as if this were all boring paperwork. "Your brother borrowed against future company value several times. Then he moved funds through a shell account to cover personal obligations." "Which obligations?" I asked. Mason looked away. Grant answered for him. "Gambling." The word landed like a gunshot. I stared at Mason, waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. All those months of awkward phone calls, weirdly timed emergencies, borrowed cash, and excuses about investments and short-term liquidity suddenly clicked into place. He hadn't just been stealing. He had been digging himself into a hole and using Dad's illness as cover. "You gambled away Dad's money?" I whispered. "I was fixing it," he snapped. With hidden cameras? His face twisted. I needed to know what you had. What I had, I cried. My father's warning? The proof you stole from him? You violated my privacy because you were terrified I would expose you. I was protecting both of us, he shouted back. That lie cracked something open in me. You were protecting yourself, I said. Grant folded his arms. This family drama is touching, but I'm here for the asset transfer. Nora laughed once, incredulous. You're not getting anything. The emergency filing froze the estate this morning. Grant's eyes sharpened for the first time. You did what? By the time you got this text, she said, the bank had already been notified. The trustee was contacted, and the police have a copy of your email trail. Mason turned to me in disbelief. You've been setting this up? No, I said quietly. Dad did. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket. He left me everything. The recordings, the photo, the account trail. He knew you were stealing. Mason's face collapsed in a way I had never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, something closer to defeat. Dad knew? He whispered. Yes. For a moment, all of the room's noise seemed to vanish. Then Grant moved. He reached for the file on the table, but Nora stepped between him and the documents and said, Don't. Grant's jaw tightened. You're making a terrible enemy. No, she said. You already did that when you began laundering funds through a dying man's company. At that, Mason finally looked at Grant like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. You said the tax issues would disappear, Mason muttered. Grant gave a small shrug. I said many things. Mason laughed once, broken and bitter. You used me. Grant met his eyes without blinking. You were usable. The humiliation on Mason's face was almost hard to watch. For years, I had imagined this moment as revenge, as proof that he deserved every ounce of pain coming to him. But standing there, watching him shrink under the weight of his own choices, I felt something stranger than triumph. I felt the ugly truth of him. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't untouchable. He was just weak enough to trade his family for the illusion of control. He made one last, desperate move. You think you're innocent? He said to me, eyes wild. You always acted like you were better than me. Dad trusted you more because you played the good daughter. But you weren't there when the bills piled up. You weren't there when he asked for help, and I had to carry everything. My throat burned. You carried everything? Dad was dying, Mason, and I was drowning. So you stole. His voice cracked. I made mistakes. I stepped closer to him. You put cameras in my bedroom. He looked away. I listened to Dad's recordings, I said. He begged me to trust no one, especially you. Do you know how that feels? To hear your own father warn you about your brother before he's even in the ground. Mason swallowed hard. For the first time, he seemed small. Not dangerous, not powerful, just small. Then, he whispered something I did not expect. I didn't know he recorded that. Mianga faltered. What? He looked up, and for the first time there was no performance in his face at all. I knew he suspected something. I didn't know he was keeping audio. I thought he was just mad. I thought if I could fix the numbers before you saw them, I could save us. Save us? I said. He gave a bitter laugh that sounded close to crying. I know how that sounds. It sounds insane. It was, he said. Everything got out of control. Grant gave an impatient sigh. This is pathetic. Shut up, Mason said suddenly. The room went still. Grant blinked, then slowly smiled. Excuse me? I said shut up. Mason stepped toward him, the years of submission and desperation finally turning into something ugly and honest. You told me you could manage it. You told me the cameras would keep Claire from getting suspicious. You told me the money would be enough to cover the bridge loan. You said Dad wouldn't notice. Grant's expression cooled. And yet he did, and you let him die thinking I was the one betraying him. Grant's smile disappeared. That was the moment I knew Mason had crossed a line he could never uncross. Not because he had admitted guilt, but because he had finally realized the man he trusted had never seen him as anything but a tool. The police arrived less than 10 minutes later, thanks to Nora's earlier call, and a quiet tap from a neighbor who had spotted suspicious activity in the warehouse parking lot. Grant tried to talk his way out. Mason tried to argue that he had been manipulated, not criminal. Neither one worked. By midnight, both of them were in custody. The fallout was worse than the arrest itself. The recordings from Dad's phone, the bank transfers, the shell companies, the emails from Grant's office, and the surveillance equipment in my apartment all became part of a civil and criminal investigation that stretched over months. Mason was charged with financial fraud, unlawful surveillance, and conspiracy related to the misuse of company assets. Grant faced much heavier counts. Once his books were opened, investigators found a web of hidden payments, false invoices, and illegal transfers tied to other businesses as well. People in town were shocked for about 12 hours. Then they acted like they had always known the Bennetts had problems, because that is what communities do when a scandal finally gives them permission to gossip aloud. The attorney who drafted the codicil was interviewed, and later admitted Mason had pressured him after Dad became too weak to attend meetings. Edgar Shaw's role was not as innocent as he first pretended, but he ultimately cooperated once Nora threatened to expose his unethical handling of the estate. The amended will was challenged and overturned. Dad's original intent was restored. The company did not disappear. That mattered more than anything. We sold off the toxic contracts tied to Holloway and kept the parts of the business that were clean. Several longtime employees stayed, including a foreman named Dennis who had worked with Dad for 22 years and cried openly when he heard the old office was staying in the family. The company was reorganized under a new trust with me as temporary executor until the court finished sorting the remaining issues. And Mason? He called me from jail twice. I ignored the first call. On the second, I answered only because I needed to hear what kind of man he would be, without a smile to hide behind. His voice sounded wrecked. Claire, state your business. A long silence. Then, I'm sorry. I sat in my apartment by the window, looking out at the dark street. That's all? I know it's not enough. No, it isn't. I never meant for it to get this far. That is not comfort. I know. Another silence. Then he said something that pierced me in a way I did not expect. I think Dad knew I was beyond fixing. I shut my eyes. For all the anger I still carried, that sentence hurt because it sounded like the truth. Dad had loved Mason, even after years of disappointment. I knew that. He would not have hidden those recordings unless he had been desperate. He probably spent the final months of his life trying to decide whether to protect his son or protect the company and me. In the end, he chose the truth. That was the last gift he gave us. Mason asked whether I would come to court when his sentencing happened. I told him yes, not because I forgave him, because Dad deserved to have both of his children there when the final version of the story came out. When sentencing day arrived, Mason looked thinner, older, stripped of all the easy confidence that used to hang off him like a tailored jacket. Grant Holloway received a longer sentence after investigators connected his company to several other financial crimes. Mason got prison time, restitution, and a future that would take years to repair if he ever managed to become the kind of person who deserved it. Edgar Shaw lost his license. The bank froze the accounts. The fake transfer trail unraveled. The cameras in my room became evidence in a case that made local papers and then disappeared into the kind of slow justice no one claps for but everybody needs. The real ending came later. Months later, after the last hearing, after the last box was carried out of Dad's old house, I went back to the bedroom where he used to nap in his recliner and read the paper. The room was empty now, except for dustlight and the smell of old wood. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where the family had broken apart. Then I found one final envelope tucked inside the top drawer of his dresser. My name was written on it. Inside was a short note. Claire, if you're reading this, then I was right to trust your eyes. I'm sorry for the burden I left you. I tried to make the family strong, but I missed how far some people can fall when they think they're owed everything. Do not let bitterness live where love used to be. Build something honest. That will be enough. I cried harder than I had at the funeral, not because of the pain, Because for the first time in months, I felt like my father was speaking to me without fear or disappointment in his voice. Just love. Tired, imperfect, steady love. I framed the note and kept it on my desk. As for Mason, I never saw the old version of him again. Maybe prison stripped away the lies. Maybe losing everything did. About a year later, I got a letter from him through the proper channels. It was longer than the phone calls. Quieter somehow. He admitted what he had done, without excuses. He apologized for the cameras, for the theft, for making Dad spend his last months afraid. He said he had entered a treatment program in prison after a fight over gambling debts, and that for the first time in his life, he was being forced to sit alone with himself. I read the letter twice and then put it away. It did not erase anything. It did not bring my father back. It did not make the betrayal cleaner. But it was real. And maybe that was the only kind of redemption he was ever going to earn. People sometimes ask me whether finding the cameras was the worst moment of my life. It wasn't. The worst moment was realizing they were there and understanding, in one silent instant, that the person behind them had once slept under the same roof, eaten at the same table, and heard the same father tell him that family was supposed to mean something. The best moment came later, when the truth finally dragged everything into the light. Because the ugly thing about betrayal is that it always thinks it can stay hidden forever. It thinks the walls will keep secrets. It thinks grief makes people weak. It thinks family loyalty can be twisted until no one notices what got stolen. But truth has a way of surviving the dark. My father taught me that, even from beyond the grave. Mason taught me something too. Greed doesn't just destroy trust. It makes cowards out of people who were once given chances to be better. And karma? Karma is not some magical instant punishment. It is slower than that, more honest than that. It is the moment every lie catches up. It is watching the life you built on control collapse, because control was never the same thing as love. It is standing in the wreckage, and finally hearing the truth you spent years avoiding. For my brother, karma was the cell door closing. For Grant Holloway, it was the full exposure of every deal he thought would stay buried. For me, karma was harder and quieter. It was learning to live with what was done without becoming what hurt me. I kept the company. I kept Dad's name on the door. I paid the workers. I rebuilt the books. I donated part of the recovered settlement to a victims' privacy fund in our county, because I never wanted what happened to me to happen to anyone else quietly. And I moved out of that apartment. I still remember the red light in the smoke detector sometimes, the tiny blinking eye that made my whole life split in two. But when I think about it now, I don't feel hunted anymore. I feel grateful, because if I had not found those cameras, I might never have learned how deep the betrayal went. I might never have seen the truth in time to stop the theft. And I might never have understood that my father's final message to me was not just a warning. It was a test. He knew I would notice what others missed. He knew I would look closer. And because I did, the people who tried to bury the truth were the ones who ended up buried by it. Not in the ground, in their own consequences. And that was enough.